So, hello. I'm I'm kind of excited to be here. And yeah, I'm Cherionna Menza-Sills, and I was asked to say a few words about myself, so I'll try to remember who I am. um, you know how it is in this work. It's like who I am isn't that important. The work is what's important. But as you can tell from my name, if you don't already know, I'm very grateful to be married to Franklin Sills. And we just had our 12th wedding anniversary, actually, on Sunday, and went out for dinner for the first time in almost 3 years. It was amazing. So yeah, even we've actually been together for 14 years. And maybe I'll just start this by saying that, I was teaching craniosacral biodynamics at the time, and I had been for a while, and I'd been practicing cranial work since I think 1991, something like that. So I knew a little bit. I understood a bit, and I perceived more and more, and I helped people to perceive more and more. But what I found being in relationship with Franklin, so he was so clear about these concepts, and I learned so much from our endless conversations about this work. We did occasionally talk about other things too, but we both really love the work. So I feel like it really helped me to clarify so much more. And he actually asked me to write this book. Which I understand. If you haven't seen it, I understand that it's helped a lot of people to understand the work more, because I like to make things as simple and straightforward as possible. So I hope that's helpful for you too. So yeah, part of my background is that I'm also a continuum teacher. Some of you might be familiar with continuum. It's a mindful movement practice that was developed by Emily Conrad, my dear mentor, who sadly passed away 8 years ago. But it takes us into similar perceptual territories as biodynamics. And so it's a very embodied way to experience it. And I'm also very passionate about embryology and pre and perinatal psychology. And actually, while I was working on my PhD in pre and perinatal psychology, which I realized was about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, almost. I felt there are no programs in pre and perinatal psychology, so I had to create my own. And I felt that learning about how we form physically and energetically was essential to understanding our psychology. Because when you're this big, your experiences aren't separate from your body. They never are, but we like to pretend they are. We forget how important the body is. I've really dived into embryology, and it's very relevant to the topic for this evening, and I'll be bringing some into the seminar in January, which is basically on ignition processes. And maybe I'll just say before we start, there's probably enough about me, my background, but I'll say just about ignition and how I'm talking about it is I've really been informed by Franklin and his approach. And I know there are different ways of looking at ignition, and there are different ways of looking at all of these phenomena. So I'm really coming from what I learned from him, and what I've learned from the work directly. So it may be different from what you've studied before. I don't know. I kind of hope it is, so you have a different perspective and you can see what feels right to you. So I hope this sounds interesting. The topic for today is exploring long tide and ignition. And what I'd like to do, we have about an hour and a half. I'd like to guide you through a meditative process, kind of exploring that a bit in ourselves. And then I have a PowerPoint presentation to talk about some of the concepts a bit more. And depending on our time, we might do a little bit more meditative exploration after that. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So how does that sound? Those of you who are visible. Yeah, great. And feel free if you want to make comments in the chat box. That can be a good way to communicate in these events. And when we're actually having discussion, if you can put things in the chat box, or if you prefer, I'm really happy for you to raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and speak. So why don't we settle a little bit together? This will probably be about 15, maybe 20 minutes. So yeah, it's finding a comfortable position to be in. Probably sitting up, as the people that I can see are sitting up. But letting yourself be curious if it's possible to be a bit more comfortable there. Is it possible to rest a bit more in whatever position you're in? And if you're moving to get more comfortable, can you be aware of the sensations that are guiding you in that? We're always being guided by sensations. We often don't pay conscious attention to them. And if you find yourself just sitting more still, perhaps starting to settle, what are the sensations that speak to you of settling? Or what tells you that you're comfortable? And just as a starting point, being curious about what's present for you as we begin. You may have some thoughts, some expectations, anticipation. You may be wondering what we're doing, or you may have something left over from your day. Or maybe you're very peaceful. Maybe some feelings, emotions. And again, whatever is there are sensations with that. And perhaps the sensations include a sense of breath. The breath of air, how the breath moves through your body. And feel free, if it helps you to focus, to have your eyes closed. If you're someone who knows about yourself that you tend to dissociate, kind of disappear, or go to sleep when you have your eyes closed, I suggest having them open just a bit. A soft focus. What is your sense of breath in this moment as we begin? Perhaps being curious about where and how you sense the breath in your body just now. You might be curious if there are parts of your body that participate more with the breath than other parts. So do you just feel the breath in your chest, diaphragm, stomach area? belly. Or maybe you feel the breath in other places. Every cell in your body is breathing. Can you feel that? Or what happens with that idea? Perhaps there's a little ignition of the breath somewhere, a lighting up. Perhaps a sense of some warmth or tingling somewhere that you weren't aware of before. And perhaps there's also a sense of the support of whatever you're sitting on. Mama Earth under us. Can you feel that support? Can you feel where your body makes contact with what you're sitting on? If you have a backrest to your chair or something you're leaning against in the back, can you feel that? Legs, feet. Physical body. Is there any sense of being able to rest here in this physical body? And the breath, the ground, the support of gravity under you. And what supports you in resting just a bit more in this moment? Settling. And as we begin to settle within the physical body, there may be a sense of beginning to soften and dissolve. We're made up mostly of fluid, of water. There may be more of a sense of fluidity. You may have a sense of the actual physical fluids, like the blood pulsing through your body. But you may begin to have a sense of a fluid, energetic body or field. A sense of more wholeness, the whole of your body rather than parts. There may be more of a sense of midline running up through the center, up and down the center, vertical center line. There may be a sense of fluid wholeness with its fluid tide. A sense of filling, a sense of rising up the midline, widening, filling. The inhalation of mid-tide or fluid tide. And you may actually have a sense of that extending out beyond the physical body. The fluid field extends out about maybe 50 centimeters. Inhalation extending out, and exhalation, there's a sense of dropping back in towards midline, down midline. You may have a sense of a pause at the end of that exhalation before again the potency, the embodied life energy that expresses in the mid-tide and the fluids begins to rise up midline, filling every cell in the body and out beyond the physical boundaries of the physical body. Being curious how it is for you, settling in this moment with this suggested awareness of a fluid field and its tide, settling, softening, deepening. And you may begin to have a sense of things getting even quieter, slower, deeper. Allowing, if you will, allowing your awareness to begin to widen out from the midline in all directions, out towards the horizon. We can begin to sense that vast field of long tide. We call it tidal body or tidal field of long tide. Very, very slow rhythm and long tide. So you may have a sense of exhalation, like a streaming in towards the midline, as if from out beyond the horizon, in towards the midline. There may be a sense of being suspended within this vast field. As exhalation streams in towards the midline, when it reaches there, it reaches the end of its cycle, it's again likely to be a pause, maybe a sense of stillness. And then there's an ignition, a spark, a lighting up as we move back into inhalation, a sense of streaming out towards the horizon in all directions. And there may be a sense of sparkly light as part of this, being suspended in this vast field. It's filling, widening. So spacious. Not really that fluid, it's more like air and ether, maybe even fire. Sometimes there's, well, ignition is fiery. There can be fast, almost wind-like movements. Hundred-second cycles, very, very slow. You may have a sense of that breath of long tide, as if it's moving through stillness, through the ground of dynamic stillness. This can be a place of very, very deep rest. Nothing to do here. Deeply healing state. Long tide, completely unchanged by the conditions of life. It's always there, available to remind us of who we truly are. And as we rest there in long tide, you may have a sense again of that filling of the fluid field, the fluid tide, something that feels a bit more tangible, more fluid, more embodied. So that fluid field is suspended within that vast field of long tide. The physical body is suspended within the fluid field, which is suspended within the field of long tide, all suspended in dynamic stillness. Fields within fields within fields. So I'd invite you to also let yourself be aware of your physical body again. Perhaps the breath of air. The support under you, your feet, legs. Maybe let your body start to move and stretch a little bit. Notice what feels good to you in this moment. If you let your body move, even if it's little tiny movements, can you feel it moving through the air around you? You may still have a sense of those fields around us. And when you're ready, if you've had your eyes closed, if they're still closed, gently letting them open. And I'd suggest actually looking around the room that you're in, seeing where you are, what's around you. Maybe there's some things around you that you like. And there's also our screen here, which is in a few minutes going to have some, I hope, enjoyable images on it. Welcome. I feel like welcoming you and all of your fields. And I don't know about you, but as we were doing it, I felt like our field just went, I got really quiet and deep. And actually, I'd love if you'd like to put something in the chat box, like a word or something about how that was for you or what you perceived. I'd love to know what your experience is or was. If there's anything you'd like to share. And I used to have to tell people about how to use Zoom. I'm assuming by this point, you probably know more about Zoom than I do, but I've discovered that I teach a lot online, but I've discovered these days people know a lot. But if you're putting something in the chat box, you can direct it to everyone in the meeting, which I would recommend, or you could direct it to me if you want to be more private about it. Oh, a lot of pain in my heart. Oh, sorry. Yeah, coming back to the suffering of life, it sounds like. And I'm not sure if you mean physical pain or emotional pain, but yeah, sorry. Probably good to be aware of it. And what I'd wish for it is to be able, and for you, is to be able to let it be supported and nourished by these larger fields. Emotional pain, yeah. And can I ask, are you okay to be with it? Not necessarily a problem when emotions come up, but it's helpful if we can be present with them. One of the things about long tide, and we'll be mostly looking at long tide today, and in the seminar, if you decide to do it, the ignition is primarily a long tide phenomenon. Oh, good. I'm glad you can be with it. Thank you. But long tide, as I mentioned, is not affected by conditions in our lives. So it's like it's always there as a reminder of what we might call the original blueprint, the health with a capital H, the intelligence with a capital I. Yeah. So, did anybody enjoy that? I don't see any other comments. So, I see a few nods. Okay. I felt a lot of strength in my body whilst relaying a difficult conversation I need to have to help me on my spiritual path. Ooh, so powerful. Oh, good. Somebody enjoyed it. Good. Thank you. That's good to know. Well, would you like to? Oh, felt like coming home. Yes. Me too. It was very relaxing, peaceful. Great. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, thank you for your comments. It's always a little strange, doing online things. It's like we're actually people here, and it's really nice if we can interact. I really like that there was a still point in the room, in the space. Yeah, so you felt it too. Yeah, very powerful. So would you like to see some images and hear a few thoughts? Okay, so I am going to share my screen. And, yeah, hopefully you can see that. So yeah, this is called Exploring Long Tide and Ignition. And these images of the cosmos are so much like these phenomena that we work with. So here we go. I'll move to the next slide. So I just wanted to review this. I would guess this is familiar for everybody, but just in case, this is how Franklin teaches this. When we look at primary respiration, as opposed to the breath of air, we can look at it as being like being in the ocean. If we look at the top layer of the ocean, the surface waveforms, we call this the cranial rhythmic impulse, or the CRI. And this isn't actually a tide. Franklin has told me when he first started teaching this work, he, for a little while, talked about 3 tides and then realized that that wasn't correct, because a tide is a biodynamic phenomenon. So I should say Franklin was informed in calling the work craniosacral, a biodynamic craniosacral therapy, or craniosacral biodynamics. He took the term biodynamic from Roland Becker, who talked about biodynamic or universal formative forces, and biokinetic or conditional forces. So the cranial rhythmic impulse isn't universal. It's not a stable cycle. It varies. If they've done research on it, varies from about 6 to 14 cycles per minute. it's very much influenced by conditions. So it's like, if you blow on some water, it ripples, right? That's the eye. And that's what we're likely to sense when we first put our hands on someone. There's a lot of rippling, a lot of movement, and it's relatively fast. And there may be a lot of interesting things happening, but in our approach, we're not that interested in that. We look for what's deeper. So we look to settle under that. And that's like going under the surface of the ocean. And then we come to the mid-tide or fluid tide, which is relatively slow, stable, 1 to 3 cycles a minute. And that's what I was guiding you through, experiencing as more of a sense of wholeness, fluid wholeness. Midline tends to become more apparent, and tidal movements in relation to to midline. Inhalation rising up, widening out from midline as the potency is rising up and filling the whole body, including the fluid field around it. And then in exhalation, come back in and down. So mid-tide is a universal phenomenon, although it is somewhat affected by conditions, okay, which it does vary a little bit. If we deepen even further, as we did in the meditation, we come to long tide. And it is a totally stable, very universal phenomenon. So 50-second inhalation, 50-second exhalation. And it's very, very slow. It's like a streaming. A sense of suspension. We'll look at it more. And I'm going to skip over the groundswell for a moment and drop down. I was describing in the meditation that you may have a sense in log tide of it kind of moving through dynamic stillness. It's something I experience a lot, that there's this ground of dynamic stillness from which the tides arise, and it's always there. And the more we are able to orient to that as practitioners, the more our clients can settle and orient to that also. And it's completely unaffected by conditions. So it's a ground of stillness. And I often sense long tide like it's moving through that stillness. So I could sense the stillness within it. The groundswell is like a very, very slow initial arising. That if you can see my hands, it's probably more like, you probably can't even see them moving, but to me, it's a sense of kind of a very, 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 very slow filling, even slower than long tide. So I hope that's making sense. And it gets probably review for you. So let's go to the next slide. And we've been working for a while with what we call 3 bodies or 3 fields of action. And so there's the physical, the tissue, cellular tissue field. And that's where you can sense motility. So with the tide, there can be movement through the tissues. But there's also, as I was describing, a fluid field around the physical body. It includes the fluids in the physical body, the physical fluids, and also extends out beyond the body, the physical body. And so the mid-tide is experienced within that whole field. And if we widen even further, we come to the tidal field of long tide, which is a very vast field that this doesn't really depict it very well, because I'd go way off the slide to depict it. It feels like it goes out beyond the horizon, and all that within dynamic stillness. So personally, what I love is sensing all of those at the same time. So physical, suspended within fluid, suspended within the vast field of long tide, all suspended in dynamic stillness. They're all there. I'm going to move to the next slide. And so we're going to be orienting primarily to long tide, which you can consider the root of primary respiration. So it's a 100-second cycle. As I mentioned, 50 seconds inhalation, 50 seconds exhalation. It's a totally stable, vast field phenomenon. There can be a sense of wind-like forces. It's not necessarily still. Not everything about it is slow and still. But so healing can happen very quickly. It can just go, and suddenly something's gone. You might not even be aware of how it happens. And there's a sense of suspension. And as I said, very, very wide perceptual field. If we go to the next slide, specifically, we sense long tide as a stable tide-like, often wind-like, streaming towards and away from a person's midline in stable 100-second cycles of primary inhalation and exhalation. It's sensed as a stable field of suspension, like the person is suspended in space. And there can be a sense of local wind-like forces, like what the Tibetans call the unconditional winds of the vital forces. And you might sense it as a radiance, like in the photo. And to me, it's very much like the cosmos. I mentioned Emily Conrad and Continuum. And actually, I'll stop sharing for a moment and tell a little story. Would you like to hear a little story? This relates how Franklin and I met, but very much involved with the work. So when he and I met, I was a continuum teacher as well as teaching biodynamics. And Emily Conrad had recognized that our tissues change shape and change the way they function, really, depending on context. To the point that she said we have 3 tissue anatomies. We have 3 different anatomies. So in everyday life, when we're, sped up and we're focused on what we're doing, or we're trying to get there, or, reading our emails or whatever it is, or texting, our tissues get more dense. Our perception gets more narrow, and we get more rigid. And she called that the cultural anatomy. And to me, that is very similar to the CRI, the craniorhythmic impulse. Okay, there's all kinds of conditional things happening, and we tend to, at that level, we perceive more locally. There's like that pain, that's what we focus on, right? That symptom. In continuum, as we do various things, we work with different kinds of breaths and sounding and intentional movement in continuum, mindful movement. And we start to slow down, similar to in craniosacral biodynamics. And as we slow down, we come into what Emily called the primordial anatomy, where there's a sense of the whole. There's a sense of midline. Is this sounding familiar? It's like the fluid field. There's a sense of fluidity. And it's much more like a little embryo that's moving and being in a very fluidic, holistic state, organizing along the midline, which we'll look at in the seminar a bit. So to me, that's very much like the fluid field and mid-tide level of perception. It's a very similar experience. And in continuum, when we slow down even further, we drop into what Emily called the cosmic anatomy, where there's a sense that we stop being so fluid. I'm demonstrating with my body. And we start to feel like we're suspended in space. And like we're completely dissolved and more just like the cosmos. You know, we may have a sense of light, spaciousness. To me, it's so much like long tide. And just the fun part, how Franklin and I met, how we connected. We had met before, but we connected when we were both presenting at a biodynamic conference in the US. And I was presenting on biodynamics and continuum. And originally I called my presentation, I think it was Continuum and Biodynamics, a perfect marriage, because I thought they worked so well together. I actually changed the name to Parallel Paths by the time I presented, but people remind me of that now. But I thought I'd mention that because long tide is very much like a cosmic experience. It's like being in the cosmos. So I'll come back to my screen and go to the next slide. And I'm sure you're familiar with this from William Sutherland, who said, "There is an invisible element that I call the breath of life. I want you to visualize this breath of life as a fluid within the fluid, something that makes it move. Visualize a potency, an intelligent potency that is more intelligent than your own human mentality. The tide fluctuates, it ebbs and flows, comes in and goes out like the tide of the ocean. You will have observed its potency and also its intelligence, spelled with a capital I. It is something that you can depend upon to do the work for you. In other words, don't try to drive the mechanism through any external forces. Rely upon the tide." So he talks about potency, which carries the intelligence with the capital I into the body. And that very much relates to ignition. So let's look at it. Keep in mind the tide with its intelligent potency, spelled with a capital I, is something you can depend upon, something that knows how. So you might say potency is our friend, and as practitioners, but also as people, it guides our formation, and we'll look at that. So Sutherland talked about transmutation, or a change of state of the forces, so the universal forces from the ordering matrix coming from long tide into the body's fluids, generating potency. So Franklin was also influenced by Randolph Stone, who developed polarity therapy, he was also an osteopath. And he spoke of basically the same thing. He called it step downs. So stepping down from the breath of life into physical. Emily Conrad, by the way, would talk about the same thing as coalescing into form. And Randolph Stone developed ways to work with ignition, which he then taught to Robert Fulford, who another osteopath, who kind of spread the word. So the breath of life manifests its creative intentions as a spark or ignition within the body's fluids. And through this ignition, the creative and ordering intentions of the breath of life are conveyed to every cell and tissue. And I love this image. To me, it's like the coalescing into form. You get the sense of something forming there. Let's go to the next slide. And this is from Franklin's book, Foundations in Craniosacral Biodynamics. He has a chapter on ignition in volume. And he's talking about the spark that Sutherland spoke of. The spark moves through the midline of the ordering matrix and generates a force or potency in the body's fluids that maintains order and generates the inherent motility of fluids and tissues. So potency. Potency is an embodied life force. So it's a step down from the breath of life, from long tide, into the physical body. It's embodied. It's an expression of long tide's ordering forces, an organizing, enlivening principle. We'll go to the next slide. And Franklin identified 3 functions of potency, which is an intelligent life force. So potency has an organizational function. It organizes cells and tissues into form. That's true in the embryo as it's forming. That formation is guided by potency. And it's true throughout life. We continue to keep reforming ourselves, guided by potency, the organizational function of potency. Potency also has a protective function. So when there's an intrusion, when there's a condition that is challenging, potency coalesces or densifies to protect the system. If the, whatever the condition is, the conditional force, if it can't be processed at the time, potency will coalesce to protect. It will coalesce around it. And that produces what we call an inertial fulcrum. And within an inertial fulcrum, there's the potency, the universal force, and there's the conditional force that's being protected from, I should say, being contained by the potency. So they're both there in an inertial fulcrum. An inertial fulcrum is a place that doesn't move as easily with the universal tidal movement. And potency has a 3rd function, which is healing. And so it initiates healing processes. So I'd like to go to the next slide and look at how that happens. And again, this may all be review for you, but hopefully it's helpful. And I think it's a pretty slide, if nothing else. So this again is from Franklin. It's in his book. It's actually in my book as well. This is how we look at the inherent treatment plan or the inherent treatment program. And so we begin with our relational field settling. So the relationship between the practitioner and the client. And in all the work that I've done with trauma and trauma therapy, I've come to understand that when somebody is in a protective state, healing isn't going to happen. Okay? If they don't feel safe, if their autonomic nervous system doesn't recognize safety, they're not going to heal. Okay? They're going to be in a defensive mode. So if you're familiar with Stephen Porges's work, We have these defenses, our sympathetic fight, flight, and our parasympathetic freeze, shut down. In those defensive states, we're not able to accurately perceive safety in present time. And those have to do with our relationship. So if we don't feel comfortable with our practitioner, or if our body, our nervous system doesn't feel comfortable with our practitioner, we're not able to settle enough for the inherent treatment plan to unfold. So it's a piece that I really appreciate Franklin having brought into this work, influenced by psychotherapy, actually, that we need to be able to settle together as two human beings. And part of the settling is for the practitioner to orient to primary respiration. I mentioned earlier that, if we can orient to dynamic stillness, the more we're able to settle into a sense of dynamic stillness within ourselves, the more we support our client in being able to also settle. Okay, the more settled we are, we communicate that through resonance. And we negotiate our relational field, and which may involve a little bit of talking, how are you? What's happening for you just now? And looking at what supports them in being able to be with whatever is going on for them. So we work with resource, what supports you in being present here. So the person can start to settle with us, and we're social beings. We need to be able to talk a little bit. So once the relational field has settled, and we often sense that energetically as things feel calmer between us, then we move to a second settling, which is holistic shift. And so here the practitioner settles into a receptive state oriented to primary respiration, and the client's midline and biosphere, the fluid field, shifting from conditions, and the CRI level of expressions occurs and deepens. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we tend to sense craniorhythmic impulse, a lot of activity, and we're listening for that to settle. We're intending to settle under that and start to have a sense of wholeness. Holistic shift is a shift to primary respiration and wholeness, rather than just the CRI, okay, or just what hurts, just the conditions. Once we've settled into holistic shift, and personally for me, I often sense that. Often I'm starting at the feet to sense that. And I may at the beginning, often in the beginning, I feel like I'm just holding the feet. And they're like physical feet, and there's like all the activity, often a lot of nervous system, pulsations, and, various kinds of activity. As things start to settle, I literally start to feel like my hands extend up the person's legs. They might feel it too, as if I'm holding up to their knees, and then their hips, then their lumbar area, thoracic, up until I'm finally holding the whole person. Like when you hold a little baby, it's like they feel that your whole hand almost. I start to feel like that. And that speaks to me of wholeness. And usually somewhere in there, I start to sense tidal phenomena. So as we deepen, as we settle into holistic shift, then the healing intentions mediated by the breath of life emerge. And often that involves this one in the middle, shifting into a fluid field, fluid tide level. So holistic shift deepens and healing intentions emerge within fluid and physical bodies mediated by tidal potencies. And this is where you'd have a sense of Becker's 3 phases, which I imagine you're familiar with. The sense of seeking, which means that in the inertial fulcrum, you'll probably have a sense of a fulcrum kind of lighting up, being chosen by the potency and the intelligence as the next thing to work on. It's like it comes forward into the foreground. And it could be a sense of seeking within that between the conditional and the universal forces, the potency and the inertial force that's held in the inertial fulcrum, until they settle. They settle into a state of balance or dynamic equilibrium. Feels like a stillness. And something happens. Often there's some discharge, sense of heat or pulsation or something. Something happens, some changes. And then there's a reorganization and realignment, often throughout the body, as things are reorganizing because they don't have to organize in relation to that inertial fulcrum anymore. So that's all at the fluid tide level. A holistic shift might deepen into dynamic stillness, and healing intentions emerge within and from a ground of emergence that is both dynamic and vibrantly alive, dynamic stillness. What we're particularly looking at in this seminar is deepening into long tide. And so that it can happen from holistic shift that we deepen into long tide. Long tide clarifies as healing intentions emerge as an expression of long tide phenomena. So it's in this place, this level, when the holistic shift occurs, that the healing function of potency can become apparent. Okay, up to this point, it would be in its protective function. Then there's the healing function. And then whatever level it happens at, we end up with some reorganization, which is the organizational function of potency. So that's just kind of a background for looking at ignition processes. I hope this is making sense. Interesting. So let's go on. And we're going to look at ignition a bit. This is a hub, the Hubble telescope, their website. This is an animation of the Cat's Eye Nebula, which I actually can't find on Hubble. Franklin found this years ago, and I don't know if it's disappeared, but it's a wonderful animation. And we love to show it for ignition because what it's showing, you'll see a spiraling into center, and then there's an ignition and a field is established. This is what we understand happens at conception. And you'll get a sense of what ignition feels like. Okay, so I want to invite you and encourage you to, as you watch this, to really be aware of what it feels like inside your body. You may feel that ignition. Okay, so here we go. So spiraling in, coming into the center. Ignition, you get that? Again, so it's laying out a field of light, a matrix. Levels of ignition. Isn't that beautiful? So in our bodies, it's like this, to me, this would be like the potency within the fluid body. You see how it coalesces. This is more subtle out here, and it gets more and more tangible. Would you like to see it again? I see people I can see. I see some nods. Okay, I think I can just do that. Yeah. Ignition. Feel it in your body. Notice how it's all happening within, like suspended in stillness. Personally, I could look at that just over and over again, but have a couple more slides. So I'm going to move on. So what we were looking at is like what we understand happens at conception. And Franklin has talked about 3 important primary ignitions that happen in the little one as we're forming. And the first one is at conception. This, by the way, is a drawing that I did for my most recent book, which, if you can see here, it's, for those of you interested in embryology, it's about embryology. It's called Spirit into Form, Exploring Embryological Potential and Prenatal Psychology. And it's full of my drawings. And this is a drawing of spiraling into form, which I think is very much what this ignition process is about. So these 3 primary ignitions, one happens at conception. The first one's at conception, when an ordering matrix is laid down, like what we just saw in the animation, very similar. It's like a field of light with a midline. And in the, let me just go back a slide. Can I do that? Oh, I was hoping it would show me the last bit. But remember, there's a dot in the center, and then there's the concentric circles around it. That dot in the center is like the midline. So at conception is generated the ground of being. A being is coming into a human form. And there's a fiery ignition, like what we saw, of the ordering matrix within the conceptus. So within that unicellular organism, the conceptus, there's a matrix established. And there's an intention of the breath of life to incarnate in human form, expressed at conception. With each of these ignitions, that's like the blueprint. That's how it's designed to be. But life happens. And we meet conditions from the very beginning. So conditions can be quite challenging. And we'll look at this in the seminar in January. But for example, a condition that can be very challenging at conception is if it's an accidental conception, not planned, not welcomed. It's very challenging. So the ignition can be dampened, not quite as strong, because of the conditions that are met. And when people have had that happen, throughout life, they can have issues of belonging, feeling like they don't belong, or like they don't want to be here, or they're not quite here. You know, they could be quite dissociative. So we, in the seminar that I'll be doing in January, it's a 3-day seminar, we'll work with each of these ignitions. And we work with supporting, augmenting the ignition to be more full. Okay, so where there's been there have been overwhelming challenges or very difficult challenges, and the ignition isn't full, we support it in being able to express its full potential. So the first one is conception. The second primary ignition is heart ignition. So that happens early in the fourth week, at the time when the heart begins to beat. So we'll look at this in detail in the seminar. That's the time of embryological folding, when we go from being basically a midline creature. It's like our heart that's been near the top of our head starts dropping down as the nervous system grows over it. It's like we're bowing or folding, and the heart meets the energetic heart center, the heart chakra, and there's an ignition, and it begins beating. It's quite miraculous. And so it's the heart ignition. And that is much more about the embodiment of being as we fold. So Jaap van der Wal, who you're probably familiar with, he's a wonderful Dutch embryologist. He talks about how we become more of an animal shape at that point. And if you look at the embryo at that time, it's like, it's more of a shape. It's more of a body to be in. And so this is an ignition of the embodiment of being. We're more able to be embodied. There's more of a place to be in. So the being has more of a body to actually come into and settle into. Again, there can be issues related to that time if there were challenges. That is very often around the time that the pregnancy is discovered. And in pre- and perinatal psychology, we call it discovery, the phase of discovery. And more than half of pregnancies apparently aren't planned, which means that discovery is very often not such a wonderful time. You know, parents are ambivalent, or they're shocked, or they're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Or I wasn't ready for this, or something like that. And that's difficult for the little one coming in, who really needs to be celebrated and feel welcomed in order to feel safe, you know, because they're completely dependent on being welcomed and protected. So we'll look at this in more detail in the seminar, but if there are challenges at this time, the heart ignition can be dampened, doesn't feel as strong, and there can be issues around not feeling welcomed or experiencing welcome or being discovered. You know, I often find I do a lot of supervision with craniosacral therapists, and often, especially the new ones, you know, recent grads, they have a really hard time letting people know that they exist, you know, like putting together their website, or, you know, making cards, or, you know, putting themselves out. And often that relates to their experience of discovery. You know, they want to hide. And there can be issues of being embodied, not being so much in the body. And the third primary ignition happens at birth. We call it birth ignition or umbilical ignition. And it happens when the baby comes out and the cord stops pulsating. And there's an amplification of the manifestation of potency as a formative force in the fluids at that time. So it's like a lighting up of the potency. And this is related to an empowerment of being to fully manifest in the world. So when a baby's born, they become more independent. They begin breathing on their own, eating through their mouth. They're more empowered. Their being is more empowered. But again, there can be issues at that time, like if the cord is cut too soon is a very common one that affects the umbilical ignition. And there can be psychological issues around not feeling welcomed, but there can also be like more physical issues of breathing problems and issues around being autonomous or not. So I find this very fascinating territory, partly because I love embryology. I think it's quite amazing and a bit miraculous how we form. And what I've seen so often is that our very early experience profoundly affects how we experience ourselves and our relationships and everything in our lives. So much more to come on that. And thank you for the comment. This is fascinating. Yeah, I think so too. So that's kind of these three primary ignitions. That's the main thing that the seminar is about that we'll be doing. I think, yeah, this is about the seminar. If you'd like to join us in January, it is the 20th to the 22nd of January. So it'd be 3 days online. And it's on ignition processes within the ordering matrix. So yeah, I've got the page in English if most of you probably would want it in Dutch, but I think you probably have the link already, but it's up here. What we'll be doing in the workshop is I'll be presenting information about each of these ignitions, a lot more information than this. And we'll also be working with each other. I'll be doing demonstration sessions with one of the participants, and then you'll have a chance to do sessions with each other. You'll go into breakout rooms to work with each other. And ignition processes are basically energetic processes. So I find they work really well online. So yeah, I hope you'll join us if that is of interest to you. And I've got, I think, one more slide here. If you'd like more from me, these are birthingyourlife.org is my website, which has all of my events on it, basically, plus I have various resources that would be of interest to you, perhaps. Resourcing Your Life is the online school that Franklin and I started. He unfortunately, his health is really declining, and I'm not sure how much more he's going to be contributing to it, but we do have online courses, and we also have some ebooks and various things. And also, so this is my book. You see, everybody likes my book, this cat. I love this picture somebody sent me, the cat. But I was also persuaded to read the meditations in the book. And so if you're interested, if you like listening, you can purchase the meditations at this link. And this is my new book. If you're into embryology and or psychology, you'll probably enjoy it. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, if you're interested, you'd be very welcome to come in January or to any of my other events. So that's basically what I had planned to show you. And I'm just wondering if there's any questions or comments. We just have about 10 more minutes. And you're welcome to put anything in the chat box, or if you'd like to speak, you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself. And I'm guessing that Yorick or Renee will help me to see you if you do that. Yeah, I think I said questions, but also comments. Anything you'd like to say about any of this? Are you inspired at all? See a few nods, that's good. I'm not sure, I know we all have different backgrounds, so I don't know how much of that was new for you. Some of it probably a lot of it was review. Oh, I see. Ignition video. That's why the old symbol of the sun is the point in the circle. Yeah. Oh, what is your experience with IVF? Well, that's a big question. I haven't worked a lot with IVF myself, although I've run into it a bit. And I've heard a lot about the effects in terms of how it affects ignition. I feel like it's quite a different experience. I think about what I learned from Jaap van der Wal. Jaap wrote the foreword for my book, Spirit into Form, and he was so generous. I sent him a draft to read and said, I'd love your feedback. And he ended up going through every word in the book and giving, he taught me so much. He gave me all kinds of notes. So, one of the things that he talks about is that there's like a dance of love between the sperm and the egg. And, there is communication between them. And they meet and they dance around each other and they're communicating. And depending how IVF happens, I don't think it's quite the same. And the context in which it happens can vary. I spoke with someone recently who was able to have the music that they wanted playing and, have like really kind of a loving environment within the lab where it was happening. But, I think about having conception happen through a lab technician versus through two people who really love each other, making love. It's a very different kind of context. What also happens with IVF, not as much these days because they've developed, they've kind of refined how they do it, but they used to produce quite a few embryos. And then they would reduce the embryos, which really means they'd kill off some of the embryos. And so I have worked with people who have been conceived through IVF, and they're still in shock and grieving about the siblings that they've lost. I've worked with triplets. They were toddlers at the time. I think they were about 15 months old. And this is when I worked very closely with Ray Castellino, who was a pioneer. He died about 2 years ago. But he's a pioneer in working with prenatal and birth therapy with babies and children and families. And I studied and worked very closely with him for some years. I feel very grateful for that. And he had a clinic for babies and children and families where I assisted him. And at one point we had these little triplets come who had been born by IVF. And we had all kinds of toys in the room. They could choose what they wanted. And they would always choose some extra toys. I actually don't remember how many. I think it was like 3 extra toys. And then they'd leave them behind. And they'd try to get them back. That was their game until they worked through it. And it related to the siblings that they had lost. We could feel the grief in their field. So I wasn't specifically working with them with ignition, but you can imagine how their ignition would be affected. You know, they definitely had pretty low potency. It grew over time as they resolved that trauma. It's like they ignited more. I've also worked with people who, you know, were frozen as a sperm or an egg, and they're always cold, you know. I laugh. It's not actually funny, but yeah, you know, we remember, our bodies remember what we went through. And yeah, I haven't had a chance to work with ignition with those people, but that would be really interesting. So thank you for your question. And thank you for your thank yous. Whoops. I am reading your book and are waiting for practices to discover these themes by myself. Great. Well, maybe I should mention if, oh, I'm not sure which book you're reading. But maybe I'll just mention, since we're talking about this territory, that I have a course. I had a 12-month course last year to guide people through reading my Spirit into Form book. And so we met 12 times for 2 hours on a Sunday, once a month. And every month people would read 1 or 2 chapters. And then we'd come together and I'd present. We do some meditation. I guide them through some of the material. And we do some kind of experiential exploration. And I'm just saying it because people really loved it. And they persuaded me to offer it again. I wasn't planning to offer it again, but it's starting in a month. So if you're interested, it's on the Resourcing Your Life website. So thank you for the lovely introduction to the seminar, Cherionna. Would you recommend having some basic experience with craniosacral work before following your seminar? Well, yes, it's actually designed to be a postgraduate seminar. So for people who are craniosacral practitioners, I'm not sure how it would go if you didn't have that experience. So yeah, sorry. Would it be strange to say I felt this ignition process with my son? I only say this because I went for a routine scan. I've seen the egg and was told it was coming soon. And me and my husband made good use of this egg. It's beautiful. I don't find that strange. Oh, yeah, Spirit into Form is the book. Oh, great. So you might enjoy the course. I felt like a pop in that ovary, and yes, we conceived. Yes. I think you probably sensed an ignition. That's great. Would you like me to find the link for that course? One person's interested. I can actually get it really quickly. If there's, yeah, feel free to keep putting things in. I'll just find this quickly while I'm here. And I'll keep reading. I can multitask. Thank you, Cherionna, for this broader perspective. Great. Thank you, Cherionna. I feel so inspired and also touched and still feel like coming home. Oh, beautiful. And yeah, thank you to those of you who said thank you. Actually, why don't I, while I'm looking, I will share my screen because you might be interested in our website. This is our Resourcing Your Life website. So I teach if you're interested in continuum, I teach a continuum class usually once a month. And here's Franklin teaching. We have some biodynamic courses. I'm feeling inspired to offer more biodynamic courses, by the way. And I'm going to go here to pre and perinatal. This might be a bit slow because of my internet, trying to do two things at once. And this looks like what I'm trying to find. Yeah, this is the Being with the Book course. So that's the link. I will put it in the chat box for you. And yeah, it's a 12 seminar guided tour with the author. Yeah, for anyone who's interested, I'll just put it here. So I think I got all the comments. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed doing this with you. I have to say, it's been a while since I've taught a biodynamic course, and mainly because of COVID, Corona, I took a break, and I really enjoyed this. So I think I'm going to be doing more. And certainly we have a seminar coming up in January.